Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Grief Uprooted. So, I have received so many comments, and thank you all for that, and so many different ideas of what direction to go into. Meaning, when I started Grief Uprooted, I really had an idea of where I was going to explore and how I was going to explore grief. But thanks to a lot of you, I've taken some of your advice, and I think we're going to start with some definitions, terminologies, and exactly where grief came from. Meaning, who came up with these famous 5 or 7 stages of grief? So, before we start, I think our best bet would be to take a step back and look at some terminology. And what I mean by that is exactly what is grief defined. If you were to pick up Google, as we all do, and Google grief, what are you going to find? Well, grief is really defined by a whole mental sorrow. The exact word is grief is mental sorrow of the whole person. And what I'm trying to expand on that is when we say whole person, we're meaning body, mind, and spirit. Mental sorrow can be experienced concurrently to a death and can continuously or be delayed for many years. This experience is called grieving. So, grief is really something that hits the body, mind, and spirit all at once, and that is immense sorrow. David Suzuki actually explores grief just in a small segment of one of his documentaries. It is the only experience for the human to have that they cannot control their bodily functions too. So, what does that mean to you? That means as you're struggling through your grief on a daily basis, trying to figure out how do I make myself feel better? How do I kind of get myself off the couch and moving again? Your body is trying to adjust to this too, as long as your mind and your spirit and your whole being. So, grief is not something that's just hitting your emotions. I think we often look at grief as an emotional experience, but it is a physical experience also. That being said, when someone is going through grief, they are grieving. In old culture, sometimes in this culture also, and in some faiths, we express that grieving. And how we do that is by wearing bereavement bands. Black often is associated with people who are grieving, ripped clothing. And that process is the mourning stage. That is after we've experienced some form of grief, we are now grieving and we are in a stage of mourning, which often is expressed outwardly to society, such as Black, such as bereavement bands. And these are all different ways of expressing our grief. Then we look at, what does loss mean? This is a tricky word in my industry because often when working with children, when we say we lost somebody, they often indicates we can find them. So we tend to avoid this word. It tends to indicate that something that we've lost can be found, which in this case, yes, we can find our loved ones live on within us, but we're not physically going to be able to find them. But I guess we can argue that too, because they may be sitting on the mantle in an urn, and they may be also buried in a graveyard. So these are different words that are thrown around in my industry, but we often want to be careful where we use them, especially with children. Bereavement, a state of having experienced a loss. So this word kind of goes with that one. Often you'll see bereavement leave, and Unfortunately, we don't in our workforce. This is kind of a beef of mine that we don't offer an extended bereavement leave. If we were to look at it, usually there's 1 or 2 days for people to attend a funeral. Obviously, I'm an advocate for people needing a lot more time than that, at least 2 weeks to regain composure. But that's on a side note. The other we're going to look at is triggers. Triggers are sensations that have been ignited, causing a memory to resurface or be experienced. Often, when somebody is grieving, they experience these triggers. You could hear a song that your loved one loved and you played often together. This could trigger an emotion within you. So, this is triggering your grief, which then triggers a different emotion. Could also just trigger your body. So, you don't feel an emotion, but you wonder why you're crying. You're like, why all of a sudden are my eyes welting up? Why all of a sudden am I feeling a specific pain somewhere? That's because unconsciously your grief has been triggered. Then, if we were to look a little bit farther into this, I would just like to define what rumination is. Rumination refers to telling or focusing on one's grief story for a long period of time. Completely normal. We all ruminate certain topics that we're trying to gain an understanding. Maybe consciously, we understand in our mind grief is this, it is mental sorrow, and I'm going to experience this mental sorrow for quite some time. It's concurrent, which means if another death happens, um, I will experience this all over again. But that rumination process is the ability to allow your unconscious, your mind, your spirit, to gain some knowledge and understanding of the grief that you're experiencing. So, rumination is often referred to women who constantly are talking over and over again about an issue or a problem. I'm sure men do the same thing. But this is referring to it as in your grief. And it is a way for your mind, body, and spirit to gain an understanding. So, rumination actually has a very good purpose. Sometimes I feel like it gets a bad rap, but it really does serve a purpose. And if you have someone you can ruminate with, you are blessed. That means if you have someone you can talk all this stuff over with, you are blessed. So now that we've looked at all those different terms, and I'm sure right now you're going, how does this pertain to my grief? We're going to move into the pioneer of all of this stuff, who actually came out with the first idea of grief. And that was Kubler-Ross. She worked in hospices, and she actually studied people who were dying. And in her time in hospices, she studied how these people were processing their own death. There's many, many books. There's actually on Life After Death by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. This is one of her books. There's quite a few of them. But what was fascinating was she did come out with a 5 stage model. Now, it has expanded to be 7. We are also going to look at all the controversial sides of this all, because does it pertain to us now today? Her first study, if I'm correct, was done roughly in 1969. I'm going to say what's the one book that I found in that era that I really enjoyed. But her process was that grief had 5 stages, and those 5 emotions that we experience. So when we receive a death notification, the very first thing that Kubler-Ross found that dying individuals were experiencing, but she was also able to overlay that onto grieving people, was denial. We've talked about it in my last podcast. I am a professional person on denial. It means I love to live in the bottle. As a young girl, denial became a way for me to process things as I could. So sometimes we look at denial as a little bit different, where I know a lot of people in the past look at, well, if we're denying things, we're not accepting them. But emotional denial sometimes can help in regulating the absorption of the trauma that we're experiencing. So, one of her next things that she looks at is anger. And it's once that denial passes and we've come to realize, wow, this is real. This is what's happening. So, along with denial, you're going to experience the shock. I'm sure that many of you listening have experienced these things. And when you hit the anger stage, you literally are just, mind my French, fucking pissed off. This is like serious truth. There's no denying. At this stage, you're really at that stage of refusal to understand. It's incomprehensible. You're negotiating, you're outright rejecting what you're hearing. Um, Again, we see this very commonly in people who are palliative, that are dying. These are stages that we experience, and it seems unbelievable. Then we get to the bargaining. And at this stage, it's that resistance, that really argumentative. How can this be? A lot of times in working with teenagers, in this bargaining stage, you often hear, "Well, I don't do drugs, so that's not going to happen to me." My brother unfortunately fell over the Niagara Falls Gorge. Well, if I don't go to Niagara Falls Gorge, I won't die. So there's a lot of bargaining within there. Um, because the anger is so strong. I think this is one of the misunderstood emotions when it comes to grief, because it's just so deep, very, very deep. The next stage that she talks about is depression. And where this comes in is where heavy sadness comes in, where lethargic, you become despaired, depressed. Really, this can be a phase where people will sit for quite some time, um, usually through the funeral, um, depending on your culture and how long your grieving process is placed out. Um, it can be extremely hard. And again, anybody can get stuck in one of these 5 stages that Kubler-Ross has identified. Um, the last is acceptance. And that word has such a nice feel to it, but not when you're grieving. It does not have a great feel to it. You've accepted the situation for what it is. You realize that the individual is not coming back. They have died. Um, it's a lack of drive, doubtful. It's it, it's quite a hard area to be. But with acceptance becomes the reintegration of yourself back into society and living life again. Um, and I guess that's the other positive aspect of acceptance, and the realization that we have to integrate back into society. We have to integrate back into our families. If it's the loss of a sibling, we have other siblings that we want to be there in support of and love and cherish. Family members. It's really that acceptance that this event has happened. So, this was Kubler-Ross' 5 stages. And her first book was On Death and Dying in 1969. And it was inspired by working with terminally ill patients. So as time went on, everybody did look at these 5, but we started to notice they didn't come in an exact pattern. As I described them to you, they came in this pattern, right? Where first you're shocked. It does make logical sense when you listen to it that first you'd be shocked, then you'd hit denial, then you would. But what we started to notice was as the years passed, and she started to, Kubler-Ross co-authored a book with David Kessler, and they started to kind of relook at the model and also look at other types of things we would grieve, such as the loss of a baby to miscarriage, divorce, pet loss, all these other areas that people are grieving. And then we started to create models that you would go in circular or more waving patterns of kind of like a roller coaster, which a lot of people refer to their grief as. I'm on a roller coaster because we started to notice people would bounce back and forth to denial and shock. And if you've listened to the prior podcasts and you hear my story, that is something I did. I used a bottle as the analogy. It was the best way to describe to the world how I felt. It was like I was living in a bottle of shock and denial. And it was like watching a movie. And then every once in a while, the lid popped off, and I would be in actual life and I would feel the shock, the denial, and the anger. But I was able to cap it back into the bottle and move on. So, similar to the roller coaster, there's a baseline. And what you find is first you're shocked and you're falling down and going to denial, and then all of a sudden you pop right back up over and you're in anger and bargaining, and then you find yourself falling down again into depression, and then you fall back up into acceptance. So you have that base timeline, but you're going my little analogy there, and that in turn starts to cause the unconscious and conscious body, mind, and spirit to feel all discombobulated. One day we're happy, the next day we're sad. And this is where people started to go, there may be not just 5 stages. There's much more to grieving than that. And what came out of that was that there was never really anything to demonstrate the stages. It was never really documented. Um, so people kind of looked and went, these were common things that happened to people, the stages 1 to 5. And that's what we started our education on this, and gave us a platform to grow with grief. There were limitations to the method, and they were kind of blurred. So now we're looking at things a lot different. And what we're realizing is that grief is different for each person. Each person, given the circumstance of their grief, how did they know this person? How was their interaction on a daily basis with somebody? Was this somebody they spent every waking moment with? Was this, a pet that they took care of and spent every waking moment? Was this a parent child relationship? How did that individual die? Was it a car accident and a sudden death? Or was it a long term illness? All these factors now come into how an individual will process, will grieve, and will heal. So the 5 stages are very common. We hear them often. Many times people will talk to me about them. How I have always put the 5 stages is onto a pinwheel, where the center of the pinwheel is you, and each point of that pinwheel is a different stage or emotion that we're feeling. And some days our pinwheels are spinning, and other days they're stopped on one emotion. We might feel depressed all day. We might feel happy, and then it shifts and we feel guilty. Life is the wind. Every day the weather is changing, and every day we're feeling a different emotion. So we're going to kind of look at that as that's your starting point for what grief is. Grief is a deep sorrow within the body, mind, and spirit. It is a collection of emotions. It's a collection of feelings. It is not one thing. It is not identified as this is sadness, this is denial. It is a collection. And I think that collection is what's caused such great confusion in the study of thanatology, death and dying, and the study of grief and how we heal. It encompasses so much more than just one emotion. And the other part of that that can become very confusing for people is the roller coaster can stop. You can stop in denial and stay there. You can stop in anger and be angry for the rest of your life because your loved one died. So, as you're spinning with this pinwheel of emotions going on, you're also dealing with the fact that you can become stuck. So you'll often be wondering why, like, why today am I angry all the time? I have worked with individuals who have gotten stuck in anger. They cannot see past it. At that point is when we start to see addiction start to take place. And I know a lot of you have watched all those shows out there talking about addiction, and a lot of it is based in grief. A lot of it is based that somebody they loved has died. And during that process of grieving, they got stuck somewhere. And one particular individual I recall working with, very, very much stuck in anger, and ended up really becoming a food addict and just eating away the emotions, eating away the pain. Often this is done with alcohol because we're numbed and it gives us a kind of a different perspective on everything. And they become really self-absorbed in their anger, not realizing the effects they're having on other people. Um, so that central anger becomes the focus of the event that happened, such as a parent dying, a child dying. They become so centrally focused in on their anger and the experience of receiving the death notification and how their life is altered. They no longer can move forward. And that is where food, drugs, alcohol do come in, all different forms of addiction. Some people have become extremists. They are going to tackle the world and try to experience all they can experience. So, not all addictions at the time of grief can be one that is debilitating. Some people will start really exploring life and going, it's time to live. It's time to learn from this lived experience I had and change my perspective. So, let's take a step back. And what would you do if you got stuck in one of these stages? If all of a sudden you had a loved one who was stuck in anger? We're going to use that as our example. The best bet is to walk gently, is to reassure them that you are there as a support system and you're there to walk with them. The hardest part of doing this is like petting a very angry dog, because the closer you get, the more you tap into that anger that they're feeling within their grief, and they're going to snap back. So we want to be able to really give them the ability to explore this. I often suggest we have like smaller style books, just throwing them in the mailbox. It's just a very easy read talking about anger. And also showing them that you are there as that support system and that you're really, the anger's there, but it's okay to start talking about it. As we move on, we're going to really take each of these emotions and explore them in the continuous of the podcast. So, right now, I just really want to show you that one of the best ways to get through is to open the conversation, to show up. If somebody is in that state of depression, to show up, to offer, that extra counseling, that extra coaching, that extra ear to hear them, because they are ruminating. They're working their way through this process of grief. And grief isn't worked within a week, it's not worked within a year. It can be a decade before somebody gets to acceptance, but it's all done at the discretion of the individual who's grieving, where they want to go, what they want to experience, and how that process is going to work. And it all derives on how they were related to this individual, how the person had died, how they received that death notification. There's so many particulars. It is not just 5 stages. This is what we experience. All these other elements come into it. And that's why we're so confused. That's why everybody kind of avoids this subject. Everybody doesn't know how to talk about it. Everybody doesn't really understand it. And that's why we're doing this today. So we can start really grasping this and helping each other. And so when we look at all of this and we see all this terminology and we see the fear of really approaching any of these subjects with people, um, we got to figure out how are we going to talk? How are we going to bring the topic up? I'm the first to say, man, when I walk in a room, no one asks me about my job ever, 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 because they're waiting for me to start talking about death. They're waiting for me to talk about my job and the people I experience. Well, I'm here to tell you that I experience the most amazing people on a daily basis. These people have experienced human sorrow. What happens after that is they do go through a process of great pain, but also a process of renew. It is like that butterfly and caterpillar. You all of a sudden realize how valuable your life is. You all of a sudden realize that grief is something no one prepared you for. No one told you this was going to happen. And when you experienced it, it debilitated you. It took you to your knees. But as you educate yourself and as you experience the process of renew, of coming back from that trauma, from rebuilding who you are, really, it makes you look at your belief system. It makes you look at those core values and you start to switch and change them. And as you do that, you are breaking out of that cocoon. You are becoming that butterfly. You're becoming that person whose wings will spread. And not only this time will they walk the earth, they will fly the skies. Grief is something to give you the ability to renew, to come back, to fly. We grieve because we love. That is why we grieve. Grief is the result of great love. So you should be proud that you have the ability to love beyond borders. Until next time, realize that grief is part of us and it's integrated into who you are. And that makes you a better person. Take care. Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experiences.